Hey guys, this is Paulo with Meditation Amsterdam, and in today's video I want to talk about this notion of a gap between our perceptions, the thoughts that they trigger, and the actions that those thoughts trigger in turn. And it comes from this notion, and someone, there's a quote out there from a fairly famous teacher that says that between the things that we perceive and the actions that we take, there is a gap, and that gap is where our freedom sits. And I was for a long time convinced that that was the fact, or that that was a fact, and at the same time frustrated about the fact that I wasn't able to use that gap. And I've come to realize that that gap very often is either too small for us to notice and actively use, or too hidden to be noticed, or maybe doesn't exist at all. And therefore, it is a gap that needs to be found and cultivated and expanded for that gap to make any difference in our lives between the things that happen and our reaction or response to those things. I link, or rather the person that created this quote links that gap to freedom. And the title of this video also makes that link. There is a direct relationship between our usage of that gap and any semblance of freedom that we may have. And what's interesting about it is that very often we take freedom to be about doing whatever we want, where this definition of freedom has much more to do with not reacting, the ability to do nothing as being the primary hallmark of whether we are free. In other words, whenever something happens around us, are we compelled to react, or do we have the choice to respond or not respond? And if the default is to do nothing, in other words, the capacity to simply perceive without that triggering any action, then that would be the ultimate hallmark of freedom. It was Ramana Maharshi that really emphasized on stillness and silence as being the ultimate teaching, because that is when your mind can be totally still and your body can be totally still, and there is no need to express or to respond or even react to things, then that means that there is a true gap between stimulus and reaction or response. So we will also notice that when it comes to topics which are strongly affecting us on an emotional level, that the gap between stimulus and response becomes very small and very fuzzy. It's very difficult to make use of that gap. Everything in our mind and our body is compelling us to take action, to do something about it, to improve things. And it's very difficult to just sit it out. So emotion tends to close that gap. It tends to make it very, very small. And the other thing that tends to make the gap either small or non-existent is unclarity or lack of awareness of our subconscious drives and needs, and our subconscious reluctances or dissociative tendencies. So everything that is not being consciously processed and clarified tends to lead to automatic compulsive actions that have a certain inertia of their own, in which the gap between the perception of thoughts, emotions, or stimuli in our environment, and the action that results from that is non-existent. We are acting on an automatic basis or reacting on an automatic basis. So there can be a gap between the things that we perceive and the actions that we take in turn, or the no action that we take in turn. But it is a gap that needs to be mostly earned for it to be effective, and for that gap to make any tangible difference in our lives. You could say that on some level, the path of cultivation is the path of clarifying the subconscious, learning to consciously become aware of stimulus in the environment, or stimuli in the environment, the thought and emotional reaction that creates, our relationship to that reaction, and also the actions that creates in turn. So there's a whole chain of events from stimulus to internal reaction to an external expression of that reaction. And if we become very mindful of that chain of events, then that chain, the links can be unlinked, they can be separated. And then there's in fact several gaps that start to appear in that entire chain of events, so that we can have ownership over that chain, as opposed to be shackled by it. I believe it was Goenka who, in his narrative about what the Buddha discovered, explains how our relationship to body sensations is where the biggest cut can be made between, or rather where the biggest difference can be made between reactivity versus activity. And that's the gap that needs to be cultivated the most, because what we are actually always trying to crave and trying to get away from, depending on whether we like or dislike, is body sensations. It is the somatic flavors that our body gives us when it likes and dislikes things. So in short, this video is an invitation to be watchful of thought and emotion that arises as a reaction or response to stimuli which could come from the outside, but can also come from the inside in the form of memories or energetic or emotional movements in our psychosomatic system. And to invite us to be mindful of them, because it is precisely that mindfulness that clarifies those relationships, the relationship we have especially towards our body sensations. And in clarifying that relationship, we start to notice that there is a tiny sliver of a gap available for us, and that gap can become deeper and broader the more we observe our relationship to our body sensations. And therefore it's a gap that can be cultivated. And in the cultivation of that gap, there is a freedom that starts to arise, in which events in the outside or events triggered inside, which lead to thought and emotion, need not be or need not compel us to take repetitive, reactive action. And that's where the essential freedom sits. So that is the essence of today's video. It's fairly bread and butter stuff, actually. But it's always nice to remind ourselves that that is a kind of essential part of the cultivation endeavor. So I hope it helps. I'm very curious what you guys make of it, and whether you have experienced that gap and struggled to make it work, or successfully made it work for yourselves. As usual, if you think that these topics are helpful to others, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing makes the channel more popular out there, and it's also very motivating. So I'll be back with more videos pretty soon, and until then, cheerio and bye-bye.